tackle a topic that is not exactly TVAM, but we are very pleased to have these colleagues of ours on the panel, and Vasu or Sreenivasan Jain, who you well know from NDTV. He's one of the truth tellers in this country. You must have seen his program, Truth or Hype. And in the honor of his program and to honor him and thank him for moderating, I'm calling my comments this morning Truth and Interpretation. Great literary festivals like Jaipur bring us the best of what is thought and written today. Each festival radiates its particular ambience. At the remarkable Boston Book Festival, I feel like a Boston Brahmin. In Hay on Wine, there is an allure of elegant arguments, usually dampened by the weather. At Paris, I always feel at once that I'm at home and in the world. The Author's Lounge is an intimate adda, the front lawn a public assembly, and everywhere around you teeming audiences from all walks of life. The JLF, I believe, is a true republic of letters. When I'm here, I feel I'm a writer citizen, and you are speaker citizens, and we are all reader citizens. Not necessarily national citizens or cosmopolitan citizens, but citizens of a long lineage of letters. In the Republican spirit of self-government, too little in evidence today, I would like to make a proposal that would enhance the great spirit of cultural citizenship that embraces the Jaipur Literary Festival. Each year I would ask my friends, the talented curators and organizers, to elect a presiding deity, a writer, a thinker, an artist or a musician, preferably from the past, whose absent presence would hover over the occasion in a spirit of provocation, even indignation, and sometimes, of course, inspiration. Not hero worship, dear friends, no holy humbugism. I'm thinking of an opinionated writer, a pugnacious artist, a provocateur who shoots from the hip, pokes you in the rib, and says, "Wake up. Aren't your eyes open to what's going on? I told you so, and I told you so ages ago." Like Hamlet's ghost, who gives Hamlet the tools with which to probe his condition, I propose that the visiting deity at Jaipur should preferably be dead. I think you'll understand exactly what I mean and the kind of writer I'm after when I propose George Orwell to be the reigning deity at Jaipur today. Thank you. A difficult, disgruntled man, a dark and innovative thinker, a brilliant, if uneven artist. Orwell's masterwork 1984, published in 1949, distills the tyrannies of empire, the Second World War, and the Soviet state into a dystopic future narrative that takes place 3 decades after the book's publication. 1984 really happened in 1949. And whilst Orwell says of his time, seems uncannily true of our own. And let me quote, "In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is too often a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and even schizophrenia. When the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemisms, question-begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. That's George Orwell. Now, we need not go all the way with Orwell. I said he was dystopic, but I should have warned you that he's also dyspeptic. And yet, Orwell's unequivocal warning, when the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer, is a responsibility eminently suitable to us writers as citizens of the JLF Republic of Letters. You cannot keep politics out of language, Orwell insists, and when language is made to suffer, we suffer. And indeed, we are often put in the position of defending the indefensible. Double speech or double think is Orwell's lexicon for those in power who insist on asserting conflicting and contradictory opinions, even when they are well aware that all the available evidence is against them. When a president who has a bee buzzing in his faux blonde beehive comb-over insists that Obama was born outside the United States and claims to have seen Muslims in New Jersey cavorting in celebration of 9/11, and both things we know and he knows are demonstrably untrue, then alternative truths are occasions for the abuse of language, for evasions, folly, hatred, and even schizophrenia for an entire administration. Orwell's 1984 has now become essential reading in the US, and many of you may have heard that it has shot to the top of the Amazon list. Another great writer who is extraordinarily in demand now is Hannah Arendt, whose Origins of Totalitarianism is also a text that is deeply read. And so I propose Orwell as our reigning deity this morning, because he insists that in approaching any act of reading and writing, one must ask not only what does it mean, but more emphatically, whose interpretation is it anyway? On January the 19th, 2018, Union Minister Mr. Satyapan Singh made a scientific pronouncement that went viral in the world's press. My dear friends, this is funny, but it's no laughing matter if you get my meaning. And I quote him, "Darwin's theory of human evolution is scientifically wrong. It needs to change in school and college curricula. Since the man is seen on earth, he has always been a man. Nobody, including our ancestors, in written or oral, have said that they saw an ape turning into a man. No books we have read, nor the tales told to us by our grandparents had such a mention. All the most authoritative Indian academies of science and history wrote in strong protest against this baseless violation of evolutionary theory, this baseless description of the theory itself. There has to be some sense of interpretational good practice. Your opponent must be able to recognize the general account that you are giving of his work or her work, and you cannot simply, like Mr. Singh, assert on the basis of little knowledge and indeed profound political, strategic views, whatever you think you are free to say. That is not the freedom of speech. The right to interpretation has to be seen centrally when we think of the right to speak. For Orwell, it is our duties as citizens of the Republic of Letters to undertake the ethical responsibility, and it's an ethical responsibility of interpretation, so that we can free public reasoning from question begging and sheer cloudy vagueness. And as we begin to interpret Mr. Singh's attack on the science of evolution, we see that his case is reduced to written or oral texts and tales told to us by our grandparents, as if that is indeed the measure of the theory. Well, Mr. Singh, surely the theory of evolution is about a process of development prior to the birth of your grandfather, or humankind as we know it. For that very reason, there couldn't have been any human being sitting around watching the evolutionary acrobatics of an ape turning into a man. So, sir, it is safe to assume that the evolutionary process would have preceded your grandfather's tales by millennia. Tell me another, Mr. Singh. Whose interpretation is this anyway? And in whose political interest or theocratic belief is this interpretation being forwarded? And who is being empowered by such cloudy vagueness? And whose young minds are being imprisoned in such politically motivated travesties of knowledge? And for whose benefit are textbooks being rewritten? Some of the same questions could and should be asked of BJP MLA from Indore, Usha Thakur, who on September the 25th, 2017, provided her own interpretation of Il-ul-Adha. She said, on Bakra Eid, a son was to be sacrificed, but he was replaced by a sheep. But this is incorrect. If you can't sacrifice your own son, you have no right to sacrifice another creature. Here, however, the language of cloudy vagueness gives way to a tortuous and terrifying logic of misinterpretation. Put aside for a moment, as I have done, your personal distaste for animal sacrifice. But then ask, Usha Thakur, are you proposing that the appropriate ritual practice ought to be child sacrifice? Are you seriously suggesting that there is an equivalence between the murder of a child and the slaying of a sheep? And please tell us, Usha Thakur, whose interpretation of Bakra is this anyway? The appeal to one religion or cultural element of the composite and syncretic culture of India on the grounds of patriotism or religion or populism or belief is to distort the fine balance between cultures, beliefs and communities that represent the wonder that was India and the wonder that could become India again. It is my view that our communities are crucibles of conversation and dialogue, and an essential part of democratic dialogue is public dissent, not the criminalization of dissent, so long as it does not break the law or causes harm to individuals or groups. Without dissent, there can be no hope for recovery, for progress in a democratic society, and this surely is the lesson of Gandhi, of Tagore, of Ambedkar, of the great saints, and several other pioneers of freedom. Good governance requires the wisdom of the leadership in negotiating dissent as a process and practice of learning and living together. We have to learn to negotiate dissent, not to negate it. There is a trend in many nations today why didacticism takes the place of democratic dialogue. There is a corrosive contradiction in world politics, not only in India, between globalization for foreign consumption and nationalist populism at home. Our Constitution is a fine instrument of equality with checks and balances to protect minorities as part of a larger national interest. Once the state devises majoritarian instruments of intimidation and exclusion, whether in Hungary or the United States, or India, or anywhere else, then it aims itself indiscriminately against the enemy within. Dalits, Christian, Muslim, dissenters, the LGBT community, NGOs, and it goes on and on and on. Then democratic participation is overshadowed by authoritarian paranoia, and citizens are excluded from their own nations. At the very top of my talk, I quoted Orwell's words, "In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. When the general atmosphere is bad, language suffers." I quote them again and rest my case with my colleagues here in Jaipur for Orwell as the reigning deity for the Festival of Citizens. From him we learn that asking the question, whose interpretation is it anyway, is a way of keeping us in politics while liberating language from having to suffer the imprisonment and the perjury of double think and alternative truths. Thank you very much.
स्टेज पे आ जाओ मैं नहीं मैं आ रहा हूँ ऊपर आ रहा हूँ.
Okay, let me just go with this till then. I don't know if there's going to be feedback with two mics. Should we just try this mic? So, sorry. Thanks for that, Homi. I think the idea of having Orwell as a presiding deity for JLF is an excellent one. Till such time as the organizers decide whether they want to go ahead with that or not, we should be gratified in knowing that we already have Orwellian presiding deities that keep an eye on gatherings like this. Big Brother is watching, and we're told often, so is Little Brother. Thank you, JLF, for allowing me to moderate this session of some very erudite, high-powered academics. As a television anchor, I believe my role is to lower the standard of discourse. So, let me dive straight in by taking you up, Homi, on something that you said about the fact that language suffers in these times. Now, one would hope that at the very least language suffers, because unfortunately, those who are often asserting these falsehoods or these deliberate distortions are not doing it on the well-appointed lawns of Diggy Palace, but are doing it quite literally at the barrel of the gun. I mean, the Karni Sena is not having a roundtable discussion on their problems with Padmavati. There is the very real threat of violence. There is actual violence itself. So what then is the response of those of us who consider ourselves to be the arbiters of facts or of truth? Whether it's journalists, whether it's academics.
Can you hear me? Well, Vasu, you take up your struggle wherever you find yourself. And, you know, here we are on the front lawn here today, and I think this is where we need to say what we have to say, because we may or may not be able to say it in other places, which, as you say, may be more intense. But I think that the issue to be, to really hit back at now is words create. They don't only suffer, they can actually create violence. And what we see today, and what is something somewhat different from the question of discrimination. You know, there's a lot of discrimination, and for discrimination, there are quasi-legal solutions. We tend to think of discrimination in that way. You know, the discrimination of minority. Today we have the language of dishonor. And the language of dishonor, the comparing people, as I quote, comparing people to animals. Comparing people, talking about the murder of people, Mr. Trump. Mexicans are all murderers. This way of dishonoring people people and disrespecting people is not the same as, although it accompanies discrimination. This is a way of saying these people who we dislike have a second nature. They're not fully human, they're partly animal. So that in a way, or they're partly outside the pale of humanity, you can be violent against these people, actually, because they're not fully human. They have this second nature. This deprives them not of the rights of citizens, but of the rights of man. And I think this is why all this abuse that is used, and people say, oh, this is only heightened abuse, is not abuse. It is creating a category of people for whom it is possible for you to persecute. Subconsciously, not even maybe consciously. And I think that's the language of dishonor is hugely problematic.
Okay, Maya just now, you wanted to come.
Is this working? Yes, I think so. Good. Yeah, I just thank you, Homi, for those remarks. I mean, any invocation of Orwell is a welcome invocation, I think, in these times, if also an unwelcome one, because it shows us the terrible predicament that we're in. But back to your question about what are our responsibilities in a moment like this, I want to come to an Orwellian, I think, proposition, which is that we need to stop speaking quite as much, and we need to start doing a little more, I think. And there's a principle in writing, which is don't tell, show. And I think what we can do is not only speak, but act. And this comes to something that you were getting at as well, that, you know, in a war of words, there's always going to be two sides who can manipulate those words in different ways. I think the responsibility of academics, of citizens, is to put ourselves out there, to do the work, to make the alternate case, not just to say, you're wrong, this interpretation isn't right. Go out and do it. Protest, go on the streets, do the work, do the research for scholars, do the demonstrating for citizens. Don't just tell me, show me.
Okay. Dipankar Gupta, let me just bring you in that hypothetically, it should be the responsibility of the state to ensure that you get to hear all sides, you get to hear contesting views. But what happens when the state itself becomes complicit in either ensuring that those who are trying to silence others for speaking up or for pointing out that there may be falsehoods or deliberately distorted narratives, right? Or the state itself compulsively lies?
Well, it's like this in my view. That is, people are not generally democratic minded. So citizenship is a very difficult task. And what the state's job should be is to raise the barrier and make it more and more difficult for people to indulge. Okay. Well, my view is this, that if you have a democratic state, then the job of the democratic state is to make entry into violent behavior and sectarian behavior difficult. You're not going to change people. People are very difficult to change. I think generally most people believe that they are the best and everybody else is 2, 3, 4, and 5. Some may even be tucking a tail under the pants. But the fact of the matter is that this is the way people are. And the job of a democratic state is to make sure that these things don't happen. Incidentally, we sometimes give in to narcissism. We say we are living in the worst of times and we take a certain pleasure from it. But the fact of the matter is, it's been bad times always. I don't know of a single democratic moment which is not a crisis-ridden moment. Every democracy must face crises all the time. It is the job of democratic leadership to make sure that we don't descend into being animals of the worst sort. In fact, when we talk about whose interpretations anyway regarding evolution, I know whose interpretation it is not. It is not the interpretation of apes. They would certainly object very strenuously. However, if we're going to talk about shooting from the hip, I think that's very different from shooting from the lip, which most of us tend to do. The most important thing is this, that you must remember there is a normative content that we must all adhere to. I've heard the stuff about value neutrality and so on and so forth. I don't really buy it, because you cannot have value neutrality in a democracy. What is very, very important in democracy is the value of citizenship. And the value of citizenship cannot be neutered under any circumstance. And I think that what our job is to make sure that citizenship stands alive. Now remember, you cannot have social science without democracy. Before democracy, there was no social science. You can have rich countries, you can have powerful countries, but you cannot have a country which has no democracy sponsoring good social science. And if in India we have good social science thus far, let us thank ourselves for whatever blessings we've had. And let's not lose that, because it's very important that we stay on guard all the time, not just us, everybody. When he talked about George Orwell, what occurred to me was homage to Catalonia. And what was important about homage to Catalonia was this, the dilemma of George Orwell. Should I stand by my party or should I listen to my conscience? That was a very big thing. And I heard Obama's speech that day, and he asked Republicans, what were you thinking of? You knew this man was wrong. You knew all these things. But why do you have to stand by your party? Why do you stand up for yourself? I think democracy and social science demands the accountability that we have to a citizen, and that is a value which should not be neutered.
Okay, I want to take you up on your point about the uniqueness of this moment in just a second, but I want to bring in Sheela Reddy, because Sheela Reddy, one of the most fiercely contested areas has been writing about the private lives of public figures, whether it was James Lane's book on Shivaji, which because of certain references to Shivaji's mother, whether it was the late Professor Kalburgi, who had to face death threats in the late 80s and early 90s because of his interpretation of Basava, the founder of the Lingayat sect, Basava's relationship with his wife. So this has always been an area which is fraught with risk, and yet you waded into trying to capture, in a sense, the sort of private life of Jinnah through the letters of his wife, Rati. And I think what made it all the more challenging was that these were letters only written by Rati. There was no correspondence of Jinnah, but yet you had to sort of interpret Jinnah through that.
In a way, I got lucky because I don't think anybody really claims Jinnah's legacy in that sense. Neither side of the border is Jinnah regarded as somebody whose personal legacy has to be defended. But that said, it intrigued me because we had these two figures who basically created the geography and history of the subcontinent. And we had like 100 volumes of Gandhi speaking about his personal life. And we know everything there is to know about Gandhi's personal life, mostly because of his letters and his newspaper reports and that kind of thing. But here was this counterpart to Gandhi, and although he was such a figure over the subcontinent, we knew almost nothing about his personal life. And as a journalist, I thought, this is funny. Why hasn't somebody done a personal biography of this guy? Because he's important and he's interesting, and why should we do it? And so when I found the letters, which is another story, when I found the letters, I thought, oh, this is my opportunity, just let me go into it. And once I started going into it, I found out how difficult it was to actually document Jinnah's personal life, because in a way he himself was a participant in distancing himself from the personal side. Even in his own lifetime, when people wrote biographies of him, there was a biography written about him. All he could, he didn't participate in the biography, and when the biographer got one small detail wrong, he said something about Rati's father had given her a dowry of X number of lakhs or something. To which Jinnah wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper protesting that he got this fact wrong. And the biographer was like cringing, and he wrote back to Jinnah and said, I'm so sorry I got this wrong, and I'll change it in the next edition. Can you please read the rest of the biography and tell me if there are any mistakes? To which Jinnah replied that, why should I do your work for you? If you don't know the personal facts, just keep away from it. So basically what I want to say is that he blocked people from knowing anything about his personal life.
Right. So in a sense, it's interesting you're saying that there are no real claimants to him. So it kind of protects you from that risk of backlash. But I just want to come to you, Maya Jasanoff, on Dipankar's point about the fact that this may not necessarily be exceptional times. And this is actually something that is often used to discredit a certain kind of liberal anxiety about the fact that we are, in this terrible moment. From a historian's perspective, particularly looking at the imperial project which you studied, is there a history to this of the state using tools of misinformation, of false propaganda to assert its ideology, to assert control?
Well, I think it's no accident that 1984 is a bestseller again today, because it's, among other things, a wonderful reminder that we have been here before, that in 1949, someone, albeit a very prescient and sensitive observer of his times, George Orwell, could see in 1949 conditions around him that resembled those of today. Orwell was, of course, commenting on a moment when states were manipulating truths to a remarkable extent. The totalitarian regime of the Soviet Union was in his sights. But I think that we can see that, the control of language and the control of the dissemination of language is power. This is the central insight of Edward Said, building on Michel Foucault. We know that in imperial regimes, for example, the collection of information and then the selective dissemination of information has been absolutely vital to the maintenance of power. This is one reason, of course, that certain kinds of states control the media. And the legacy of that we have today is certain kinds of licensing, but I think it's, and to an extent still national broadcasters in certain countries. I think it's no coincidence, however, that some of the tumult that we're witnessing today is a consequence of the proliferation of forms of media, which mean that the ways in which information is transmitted today are not always in the control of the state. I'd like to make one other point, building on Dipankar's observation about democracy always coming with times of tumult, and say that right now there's been a lot of attention to the 1930s and the rise of fascism for many very, very good reasons, and ones that we should be attentive to. But I'm very struck in this moment by an analogy with another historical period, a time in which world powers were shifting, a time of tremendous energy and fertility in the generation of new ideas, a time when state structures appeared to be unresponsive to the needs of populations, and a time of tremendous technological change. And that time was the late 18th, early 19th century, the period of the Industrial Revolution, the period of the French Revolution, the period of the American Revolution, the period that really gave rise to the modern democracies of today, and the period that gave rise to many of the economic and capitalist structures that we still live with today. It took about 50 years-ish for the different upheavals of the Industrial Revolution to kind of make their way through societies in Western Europe, to make their way into what became the constitutional democracies of Western Europe and Latin America. And I think we are right now living in a similar period. We are living through a period where the digital revolution, along with the consequences of globalization, is creating a complete turnover in the way that people relate to states, in the way they relate to each other, and in the way they relate to their work. And this is a period in which, precisely, these channels of communication, the ways in which states can control information, the ways in which individuals can manipulate language and communication, is really in flux. And I think we're in for
or written by you?
Well, I mean, I have a slight difference with Maya here because I think speaking is acting. Speaking is doing. After all, the things that we are objecting to are also speech acts. It's not as if people are, it's not as if the other, the other side of it is not verbal, is not linguistic, and that's the importance of Orwell, to say that every word is an action. Every word is an arm. Every word is an armament. So I think I would say that you have to speak, and what I tried to do in my speech was not simply theorize the moment, but take on Mr. Singh or take on these issues and show why interpretation is a tool for change.
Sure.
So that's what I would say there. I actually, Dipankar, very much agree with you that citizen, this is why I talked about citizenship, Of course, citizenship is a problematic concept, but if the norms and aura of citizenship are allowed to be destroyed and stripped, then we are very much lost. And it seems to me that it's extremely important today to understand how we can reclaim this acting and doing at the same time. The period that I find very interesting, Maya, is that you're quite right to point to the period of the French Revolution. Those have had great aspirations. At the moment, I do not feel that there is a major move that has that aspiration. But the real problem is that the interwar period, the period when the map of Europe was being rearranged, was the moment of certain tribal nationalisms. Not simply patriotism, but tribal nationalisms where bodies, political bodies, and individuals felt that they were themselves the apparitions of the truth. And those tribal nationalisms, I'm afraid, are with us again. Where I agree with you is that it is going to take some time to sort this out, right, particularly because of the culture of tweet, where where all information is treated as knowledge.
But, okay, let me take that question to Dipankar as well, Dipankar, because one of the fundamental premises of a democracy is the fact that we all share a certain common set of beliefs. But what happens when you are essentially in a situation, whether it's India or in America, where you're operating in different information silos? People are only now tending to interpret the truth through, as they see it, an ideological prism.
Yeah, before we ask the question, whose interpretation is it anyway, we should also ask the other question, which is not getting into infinite regression, but the other question is, whose data is it anyway?
Yeah.
We must have a discussion on data, and Maya raised the issue of Foucault. I think Foucault's greatest contribution was that how do you and I converse with each other if we don't agree on what is legitimate data? So let's ask the question, what is legitimate data? And there you'll find that in newspapers, social scientists, commentators, and so forth have no clear understanding of what should be legitimate data in a period of citizenship. That is very important. In citizenship, legitimate data is only that data which is, I might say, interpersonally valid. Intersubjectivity is very important. I should be able to put myself in your shoes and you in my shoes, and then let's discuss the hell out of everything. But let's be able to do that. Citizenship is basically being able to see the world from somebody else's eyes.
Yes.
And unless you can do that, it won't work. Citizenship, therefore, is a very conscious and deliberate effort. So when we talk about the advances of democracy, remember, these advances, Maya mentioned, these advances didn't come easy, and they didn't come in unilinear fashion. There were people out there who made it happen. They went against the tide and they made it happen. And let's sort of doff our hats to those people. And those people were just not representatives of democracy, those people were leaders of democracy. And I think when the Cold War happened, we lost democracy for 40 years. Because all we said is he a good capitalist or a bad socialist? And that is all that matters. Democracy was forgotten. In my view, if you're going to keep democracy alive, remember intersubjectivity. What does the world look like from that person's point of view? I could have been born there. What would have happened in that case? This is the entire thing of the natural lottery. And this is something which is so central to citizenship, and this is the only thing that keeps certain leaders, hold the flag of citizenship aloft. It doesn't come easy. Most of us are not good citizens. We need people at the top, and we need a good state to make it happen.
Okay. Maya Jasanov, go ahead.
To come back to what Homi said and building on Dipankar about speech as an act, perhaps maybe the greatest act that we all need to engage in more is listening as an act. Because I think you're right. I think empathy is the foundation of any kind of effective democratic citizenship. So listening as an act, perhaps, is one to add to our repertoire of acting in this moment. And I think, too, that in this question, you raised, I think, a really good point about the aspirations of the moment of the French Revolution. We've had in the history of democratic societies, the last 250, nearly 300 years now, we've had two moments of great transformation and aspiration. And the first moment was that of the Age of Revolutions, when the democratic nation-state was born. The second but that was a moment out of which empires were triumphant around the world. Western empires took over the world using their logic of liberal democracy, perversely. The other great moment of utopian aspirations, I think, in the history of democratic societies was that of the period of decolonization, when there was a period of enormous utopian investment, a sort of revivification of the idea of the nation-state as a powerful entity. And yet, what did we get out of that? We are arriving, as Homi points out, in a period of tribal nationalism. So, along with listening as an act, I would invite people today to think about what our new utopian aspiration is going to be. We need a moment of a new way of thinking about democratic societies.
Right. Sheela Reddy, let me ask you this also, because you've been a journalist as well, and this is something that I was trying to elicit from the rest of the panel, that how do you try to communicate in a way that breaks out of our silos? Otherwise, it's just, you're sort of preaching to the audience, but you have whole sections of society who simply distrust those who are considered the traditional arbiters of truth or of information. That's all now fake news. That's all liberal propaganda. How do you manage to cross over?
Yeah, I sort of feel that we are not as democratic as we pretend to be. There are so many areas of our political life that we are not allowed to speak of. I remember years ago going to Kashmir and being so shocked by the situation there. But when I tried to persuade my editor that, we should do an article on what is really happening there, although we are supposed to be a democratic press, there are so many censors that we go through. So and when I was reading all this literature and newspapers from the 1900s onwards, I found that it was the same then. And I feel that we haven't really changed as much as we like to think we have changed. There have always been these tribal pockets kind of thing, and the sheer personality of our original leaders carried us through till now. And this is like the testing time when we need to grow up and really exercise our democracy. And this is a period of chaos that's happening.
Okay.
Vasu, can I ask you one question? Can I turn the tables on?
No, you can't. You can't.
Please, let me ask
you can't. All of you are on the mat here, not me. But
you're big brother then. You're big brother and small brother.
No, I'm the small brother, especially when it comes to you. We're getting very close to the time for questions. So, audience, please do think of questions. Let me quickly just wrap, at least as far as the panel is concerned, by asking all of you very briefly, how much of the current climate, how much does the current climate of incomprehension, of distorted falsehoods, of governments, of states that are almost pathologically lying, how much of that is infecting your own work, your writing, your research, and perhaps even the ways you communicate? So perhaps just starting with Dipankar and then working our way in. Well, very briefly.
Well, that is of the essence, in fact. If you can't look at the world through the eyes of the other, you're not going to be a social scientist at all, in the true sense of the term. In fact, if you look at the history of philosophy, you'll find that from the time of Hegel onwards, I think Kant was the last person who was obsessed about the self. But from the time of Hegel onwards, everybody, Hegel, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, in all of their works, you'll find the other is very important. And without the other, they just couldn't make any progress whatsoever.
Okay.
Now, the age of nationalism and the data of nationalism and the data of citizenship are two different kinds of data. And we should be able to separate the two. In fact, Gandhi was quite unique in that respect. He was able to bring the data of nationalism and of citizenship together. And that is where Gandhi scored over the Pakistan, the Muslim League people. Because they had only one point in mind, nationalism. But Gandhi also has citizenship in mind. And that is why I think we did a better job.
Okay. Maya?
I think as a historian, I've always been interested in the question of how did we get to where we are right now, and I've been interested in unpacking that, including looking at analogies of other moments which resemble this. But what the present moment has made me think about much more is not only how did we get to where we are, but what are we going to do about it now? And so, for example, I'm beginning a new project, a new course that I've launched at Harvard, which is about the question of identity and ancestry in human history, which is a way of thinking about how we got to where we are, but is also inviting students and hopefully eventually readers to think about what we do with it. What do we do with the positions that we've inherited? And how do we use those inherited identities to forge connections and sometimes to create barriers?
Okay. Homi, briefly.
Well, it's always the best of times and it's always the worst of times, as Dickens said. So I think I agree with Dipankar, but I think that this is the moment we have to work in. So I think, that's the important thing. How much worse it is or how much better it is doesn't help us to deal with this moment. For myself, I am working now on questions of migration. But I'm working on questions of migration looking at the way in which death, the actual dying of people as well as the dying of freedoms, exists in the world today. And if you think about it, whether it's climate change, whether it's the movement of displacement of people, the question of death, not of literally dying, but social death, death as a way of surviving, death as a way of confronting dignity, is extremely important. And I think that the topic of death really needs to be resuscitated in a very full philosophical and also political way. That's what I'm doing.
Sheela?
Yeah, I sort of suddenly plunged from one profession into another, and I'm finding I'm blundering around as a beginner in history, but I discovered that it's wonderful to be a beginner in history because you look at stuff which maybe as a trained historian you won't bother to look. So you look in unusual places, you look wherever you can, and you're interested in everything that you're seeing because you're seeing it with not looking for a particular target kind of thing. So in the same way, I feel that what is happening right now that we're talking about in interpreting how the thing, I am an optimist, and I feel that there are many, many ways in which people are countering it. And, there are blogs and there are other stuff that people are doing. So I feel it would amount to something.
Okay. All right. Well, that's an optimistic note to wrap on. Now, let's get a show of hands for questions, please. And let's try and see if you can get people at the back. Yeah, if you can get it to that gentleman there at the back. And I request you just to keep your questions brief and also frame them as questions, not statements.
Okay, it's generally not a question. I'm Uday, and
I just said, my friend, I just said we need questions, not statements.
Reference to Sheela ma'am, when she was discussing about Jinnah, just wanted to know where there's a fine line between a right to privacy, of public people, and how much we can pull inside and go into the life of personal people,
Okay, all right.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to just write a personal biography because I was interested in how this person was as an individual. But I realized only after I started working on the book how interconnected they were and how difficult it is to separate the politics from the personal. And it was a kind of project where I started with to look at this marriage. And when I looked at the marriage, I found I needed to look at the politics and the history and the culture of that time because it was affecting the marriage. And when I found out that it was affecting the marriage and unraveling the marriage, it cast a shadow on events that were to come. So how do you separate the personal from the private?
In a sense, you're saying that the answer to the enigma that how did Jinnah, who was seen as the architect of Hindu-Muslim unity, become the creator of Pakistan, you're saying that somewhere the personal turmoil in his marriage could have been a factor?
Yes, there are contemporaries who say as much.
Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am, the lady in the front.
Hi, I have a question. Don't you think that interpretation has a lot to do with inherited identity and education? And then what is the role of that education? We haven't spoken about it at all today.
Is this for anyone in particular or just the panel as a whole?
No, nobody in particular. I think everybody can answer that in some way or the other.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Anyone?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, if I have a whole section on interpretation and humanities and the humanistic education, also relating with the interpretation of data. But I had to cut this somewhere, otherwise we wouldn't have had this wonderful discussion. I completely agree with you. The question of education is absolutely central to this notion of the dialogic of thinking about oneself as another, not only thinking about the other as the other, but thinking of oneself as another in that relationship. It's a pedagogical issue, it's a philosophical issue, and it's absolutely a crucial issue. May I just make one quick comment on the question of the private and the public? Sure. I think I would feel that I would feel abject if I didn't say now that of course there is a fine line between the public and the private. I think you expressed it very well. But at the moment, with the Me Too movement, many women who were taught that their private life should be kept private have come out and revealed the lives of others. And I think this is the moment of a kind of women's revolution.
Okay.
And I think we must recognize that.
All right. Yeah, gentleman there at the back. No, all the way. Yeah.
I think that's really important what is happening.
With this avalanche of information, disinformation, tweets, Instagram, whatever, all that, I despair at the opportunity to find out what is the truth and what is the rationale behind it. What is the risk of what I'd call social anarchy within the democratic society if this avalanche keeps continuing?
Maya, Dipankar, you want to take that?
Well, yes, I think it is a problem because when we were discussing the issue of whose data is it anyway, there should be some kind of a filter on what is put out. And when you have television and WhatsApp and whatever, where information can be instantly released and reactions instantly sought, obviously not much cogitation goes in between. And that is a problem, and which is why, as I mentioned earlier, handling a contemporary democracy is a very, very difficult task. I don't know how exactly one will be able to do it without being a big brother, but nevertheless, it is up to us individuals, as you asked the question about education, as individuals up to us to find all of that very abhorrent, which we don't. For example, in education in schools, we talk about science, we talk about math, but we don't talk about the other. What is it to be in the shoes of the other person? In our schools, for example, there's been a lot of opposition to allowing economically weaker sections to come into so-called posh schools. It's simply because they don't understand that those people are equally important. Unless we have that kind of consciousness, I think the television, WhatsApp, Twitter, etc., are not good for democracy. I know that for a fact because I was on Twitter for some time. I took myself off it for a number of reasons, but most importantly because I felt that I was getting a bit narcissistic.
Okay, I'm told we have literally time for just one more question. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. I want to know from you how to resolve this dilemma of or the contradiction in terms of India as a democracy On the one hand, in the globalized world, it is projected as developing very fast, high GDP growth, good governance, corruption at the high level has gone down during the present regime, and so on. But on the other hand, we have the so-called International Tolerance Index, International Democracy Index, and International Peace Index. And in all these, India is very, very low, dismally low.
Okay.
And therefore, how do you resolve the economic development and governance related to authoritarianism on the one hand,
right,
and these tolerance, peace, and so on? Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to take that?
I just want to say one quick word. The issue, I think, is very clear. Economic development and moral or ethical education don't often happen hand in hand. In fact, economic development can take people's eyes off the neighborly, the notion of hospitality, the notion of tolerance, because actually they're all chasing the big bucks. I think that the education is extraordinarily important in creating this ethics of citizenship that we've all been talking about in our different ways.
Okay, Maya, quickly, and then we have to wrap. Do you want? No, you're good? Okay, all right. Well, I'm told we're out of time. Thank you for being a wonderful panel. Thank you, audience. Bye-bye.
Let's give a warm thanks to Homi K. Bhabha, Dipankar Gupta, Maya Jasanov, Sheela Reddy, and Sreenivasan Jain, and also to Mahindra World City Jaipur for sponsoring that session.